Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here on LAPL's live YouTube channel. My name is Roya Rahimi, and I am the adult librarian at West Valley Regional Library. Today, October 11th, in honor of National Coming Out Day, we are very honored to have Dr. Espinoza here with us on the topic of coming out, where he will discuss and explore the complex coming out process. Dr. E is a clinical psychologist, primarily serves the LGBTQ plus community and its allies. I would like to let Dr. E give you more introduction about his work and today's discussion. Please type in your questions in the comment box and we will answer your questions. Dr. E, of course, will answer your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Roya. So I want to first off thank everyone for attending here, or if you're streaming this at a later time, thank you for doing your best to absorb this knowledge and participate in this advocacy and allyship. Again, my name is Dr. Richard Espinoza. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm based here in Los Angeles, and I split my time mostly between private practice and teaching. I'm also a professor of clinical psychology, and I just enjoy sharing my work not only with my students, but with the community as well. So yes, we're going to be talking about the topic of coming out on today, which is National Coming Out Day, October 11th. And this is a topic that's just near and dear to my heart. I primarily, in my private practice, work with members of the LGBTQ plus community. And the talks that I give on this topic are a digest of the over a decade of work I've done within the community. So let's get into it. So I'm about to share my slides, and hopefully this will help just cultivate a just good conversation about what this topic is about, what coming out is, how we can effectively do so. And if you are an ally to someone who may be in the process of coming out, or you suspect they may be somewhere on the spectrum of queer identities, this is meant to be informative. Please, again, yes, type your questions into the chat box. They will be addressed at the end of this talk, and I warmly welcome anything and all things you'd like to discuss based on this topic. So let's now go to my slides. Okay, so as we begin, of course, I need to thank Los Angeles Public Library for hosting this webinar. And I also have to thank the Los Angeles County Psychological Association for sponsoring this. So let's talk about it. Coming out. Let's talk about coming out. Supporting those disclosing a sexual/gender minority status. So, as I briefly mentioned, the insights shared in this presentation are drawn from over a decade of providing support and care for the LGBTQ plus community, for individuals both in the San Francisco Bay Area and the greater Los Angeles areas of California. That's where I've done predominantly my training and my practice within the community. And so first off, let's start by defining what LGBTQ is. So for the purpose of this talk, the term LGBTQ+, the plus sign pronounced as plus, encompasses those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersectional, questioning, androgynous, pansexual, intersex, two-spirit, and asexual. And this reflects the diverse and inclusive nature of this community. I do have one little point that I want to bring up with the term queer. You may find throughout this talk, I switch between LGBTQ or saying queer. Queer, yes, is an identity in itself, and it tends to be used as an umbrella term or a catch-all for those who identify within this community. And then a little asterisk onto that is that, yes, the term queer hasn't always been a reclaiming for the community. Reclaiming, I mean, is sometimes there's a negative term out there or a derogatory term. Some communities find empowerment by reclaiming it and using it as a positive. Other communities don't. So for the queer community, yes, they've taken this term that was previously a negative term and turned it to a catch-all and a positive. So typically what I'm seeing with The rising Gen Alpha, Gen Z, and most of the millennial generations are relatively comfortable using queer as an umbrella term. I find with my work over the years, some individuals of millennial generation, some individuals of Generation X and the baby boomers and the silent generation still hold this as a negative term. Queer just means odd or different. And then it was turned to a negative term as meaning effeminate and just a bad term for those within the community. Same thing goes for the word gay itself. Gay means happy, but it was turned first into another derogatory term, and that was also reclaimed by the community. So those are two examples right there of the community, this diverse community, reclaiming words that were previously intended to hurt us, and then we turn them into words that help empower us. So again, for the sake of this talk, if I say LGBTQ plus or queer, I'm meaning the entire community at large, with the acknowledgement that, yeah, sometimes that word queer is not held positively by members of the same community. So let's get into it. So who and what is coming out? Well, what is coming out and who is it for? So coming out, to put it briefly, is just sharing who we are with the world and our loved ones. So in the United States, there's an approximate 7.1% of adults who were polled by Gallup News identify within the community. Okay. And what coming out is? Well, it involves disclosing one's sexual orientation or their gender identity. And it's an acknowledgement of these intimate thoughts and feelings. And this process often begins internally. What I mean by that is it starts from within ourselves. So when someone acknowledges that they may have an attraction to members of the same gender as themselves, or any gender that is just not the opposite gender of what they are, that's usually an internal process. But when we compare that to those disclosing a gender identity, that's often an external process. Often people feel their gender is a certain way within themselves, but that's not always the case with what their body expresses. So oftentimes many people who come out as genderqueer, non-binary, transgender, and everything under that umbrella, it's usually external prompts, meaning other people sometimes have pointed out that their gender identity, their behaviors maybe isn't congruent with the physical body that they're living in at this moment. So just to summarize those two, disclosing one's sexual orientation, that's basically who you love and who you have attraction to. Your gender identity, that is the gender you agree with for yourself. So internally, do I feel like a woman? And on the external, do I present as a feminine person? That's just an example. Okay. Either way, if someone realizes they have a different than the norm, they have a different sexual orientation or a different gender identity than their peers around them, well, this is something that requires and deserves specialized healthcare and support. And why is it important to be authentic with ourselves and share who we are? Well, people often, when they receive healthcare services, they often want to receive these healthcare services from someone who they feel may have a comparable life to them. We often want to work with doctors that look like us or look like they could be within our community. Or we want to work with doctors, for example, that act like us or maybe belong or hold some of the intersections that we also hold. And at the same time, too, if one holds a gender or orientation minority status, they may want to find support, which is highly advised. And as we move on, I'll definitely talk about how finding that support is important once we understand who we are as a person. So that said, coming out is a significant life event. It's so significant that it gets its own holiday, like today, National Coming Out Day. And unfortunately, the process of coming out often stirs up and requires the processing of trauma and adversity. Okay, and this process, please know, the coming out process, it's a personal journey. It really is. Some people realize that they're within the queer community and the next day they have a coming out party. Some people, it takes a little more time. Some people, it takes months. Some people, it takes years. Some people, it takes a first marriage, and that's okay. Ultimately, When someone chooses to disclose their identity and come out, it's often first with important figures. And what the research suggests in queer theory is that those who come out, who choose to come out, tend to really focus on the people who raised them, which oftentimes is our parents. So that said, coming out is incredibly significant for all of us, and being authentic to everyone in our surroundings, the people we live with, the people we work with, the people within our community is important. But again, as the research says, the most important people for those coming out tends to be their parents. So let's continue. Okay. Now let's look at the why. Why is it important to come out? Well, let's look at the current political climate in this country. So as of this year, over 520 anti-queer bills were introduced in state legislatures. And this set a record because over 220 bills, specifically of those anti-queer bills, target specifically those with a gender minority status. So people who may identify as transgender, non-binary, and everything else under that umbrella. Of these bills, 70 were enacted as law. Okay. And we can all think of some of those examples. So there's bans on care for transgender youth, not receiving the affirming care and medicine they deserve. Also, that could lead. This also leads to the requiring of misgendering for transgender students. So if students identify as a different gender than the sex that they were assigned at birth, well, schools are being required to nevertheless define their gender by the one that they were born as. Also, in this vein, we've probably all heard about this. Drag performances have been targeted. So there's restrictions on queer communities, one of the queer community's main forms of art and performance. And then moving on, these laws enacted permit the discrimination of queer people, often based off religious beliefs. And moving on, this has also led to the censoring of school curriculum. We had them called, I think last year, the no promo homo laws, where anything related to the queer community wasn't allowed in schools. And then this also led to the book bans that we've all heard about. So this year, we saw an increase of what's called LGBTQ erasure bills. And basically, these strip away legal protections for queer individuals. And these bills, for example, these bills prevent trans youth from accessing gender-affirming healthcare. Multiple states have participated in this queer erasure. States like Florida, North Dakota, Tennessee, Alabama, Texas have all been very aggressive in passing these laws. So of all of these bills that were then passed as laws, in a total of 145 of them, many of them have at least passed one legislative chamber this year, meaning they've made it, well, a law to be passed has to pass through many governmental bodies, and 145 of these have at least passed one of those governmental bodies that make a bill an actual law. And the Human Rights Campaign, they did a memo of a poll that they conducted. And that poll actually shows most voters, people registered to vote in this country, actually believe that there's too much legislation and that it limits the queer folks way too much. And this poll by the Human Rights Campaign also showed that most oppose these bans on gender-affirming care. Most oppose these restrictions on drag shows, and most oppose the censoring of LGBTQ plus content in our schools. So let's continue on with what the costs are for living inauthentically and staying in the closet. So the costs of being closeted. I've seen this over the years take many forms in the people I've worked with. And again, it's not just the queer people, it sometimes is the allies, the people who support and love and hold space for queer persons. So some of the costs I've seen time and time again, unfortunately, is living inauthentically. So a person staying in the closet, not coming out, is at risk of just not living their real best self life. This also I've seen has led people to creating false personas. So playing it straight or just not being themselves, pretending to be heterosexual or pretending in general to be anything other than who they are authentically. I've also seen this lead to, for individuals that remain closeted, lowered self-esteem and just a poor self-image. Because if someone believes that a part of themselves, a big part of their identity, is a bad thing, well, how can they not think that their entire being is something bad or negative or is something that needs to be withheld and kept a secret? Moving on, I've also seen people develop a sense of fear and worry, sometimes manifesting in the clinical term hypervigilance, which, to explain that, that's just being keyed up or just always on edge, not feeling safe in many spaces, especially heteronormative spaces. And what I mean by heteronormative is that basically assuming that heterosexuality is the norm and is standard. Okay. Also, I've seen people, excuse me, be hypervigilant of being outed. So potential disclosure from other people or other situations that may reveal one's orientation or gender identity. Clinically, as a psychologist, I've seen this manifest in clinical symptoms. And what I mean by clinical is when it causes significant impairment in your everyday lives and gets in the way of you just completing your day-to-day activities. So I've seen this manifest in anxiety spectrum disorders, including symptoms of excessive worry, negative self-talk, and overall sense of distress and unease. I've also seen this manifest in symptoms similar to clinical depression, feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, or simply just not wanting to be alive or having thoughts of death significantly. Some other things I've seen in my professional practice is self-aggression. So sometimes manifest in self-hatred. That's not too fun. I've also seen this clinically, result in post-traumatic stress. So not necessarily post-traumatic stress disorder, which can happen, but stressors related to processing and the inability to process traumatic events or adverse experiences in one's life. I've also seen this have psychosocial implications, meaning impacting the supportive communities and relationships that we can find to thrive and do better. It's often very difficult for people to find one's tribe when they don't brandish their colors on who they are. I've also seen this result in what's called homonegativity and internalized heterosexism. So homonegativity is after someone has already dealt with internalized heterosexism and started to identify with it. So what I mean by all that is, first off, heterosexism, as I defined it before, was just assuming that being heterosexual, being straight is just the norm, is healthy, and is what should be expected from us. When it gets a little more severe, when a person actually starts believing that heterosexism or being heterosexual is healthy and normal, then it tends to lean into then what's called homonegativity, where people within the community know that they're queer, but they also agree that being queer is unhealthy, and they start spreading that negativity towards others, members of the community, and heterosexual allies alike. And then ultimately, too, I've seen this result, the being closeted result in just having a lack of your queer history, your heritage as a queer person, and just education, not knowing about this diverse, broad, beautiful culture you come from, and not knowing really significant events that really impact your day-to-day life as of today. Like many people didn't know today is National Coming Out Day. Many people don't know why it became a recognized holiday, for example. So let's look at the when, where, and how of coming out now. So for those feeling like they may be a member of the queer community, let's talk about preparing for your coming out journey. First off, I highly advise understand and check in with yourself on your emotional well-being and do some research on discovering safe spaces. Who are supportive people in your life? This could be friends, teachers, coworkers, people within your neighborhood, people within your household. your parents possibly, hopefully. And also just do some research on what resources you have. And at the end of this talk, I'm also going to provide some resources for all of you. Moving on, check in with your feelings and thoughts. How do you feel about this? What are your thoughts? What do you tell yourself? What is your narrative about your queer identity? And just check in with yourself if you experience any significant sadness or if you think about or fear harming yourself. Tell a trusted loved one, tell a mental health professional, or just someone you trust if this is the case. Moving on, reflect on any anxious thoughts or worries you may be having. These anxious thoughts may hold you back, and these are something that should definitely be looked at, identified if they exist within you, and explored with a trusted loved one or a mental health professional. Also, think about any past traumatic events and how they may have affected you. Now, I'm not saying just go trigger yourself thinking about traumatic events. What I mean is think about this, think about how these traumatic events may have shaped you. Think about how this may be holding you back from disclosing and being who you are and being comfortable in your skin. And then again, with a trusted loved one or a mental health professional, process, meaning work through any traumatic experiences that may be holding you back from being who you truly are. Then also consider how you treat yourself. Do you treat yourself with kindness? Do you treat yourself with meanness? That's not even a word, but for the sake of this talk, it's a word. But just ask yourself, am I kind to myself? Am I mean to myself? And then also too, if this applies to you, just check in on your use of alcohol or other drugs. Is this holding you back from being your authentic self? Is this maybe helping you find the escape hatch within your mind so you don't have to address things? Is this a maladaptive coping device that isn't working? Well, maybe works in the short term, but doesn't work in the long term. So check in with yourself on these things. And again, check in with yourself, a trusted loved one, or a mental health professional. And then also just carefully choose who you want to share your truth with. Choose what others you want to share your truth with. And seriously, I really mean this with my full heart. Choose your inner circle wisely. Many people refer to this as your chosen family. These are your chosen family are people that you deem important, valuable, loving, supportive, much like your own family, or sometimes even more than your biological family of origin. And then when one has thought about all of these things, process these things perhaps with a therapist, decide who you'd like to come out to first, and think about why you've chosen them. Again, oftentimes it's our parents or the people who raised us who we care the most about on their reaction to our coming out. So again, choose your inner circle wisely. And when you do plan to actually come out, think about the people you choose to come out to first, because that was probably going to signal to you the most significant relationships in your life right now. And as always, it goes, well, I should remind everyone about this multiple times, including myself. Coming out is a personal journey, okay? And it's okay to take your time, come out on your own time, process and check in with yourself of all of these things I mentioned on your own time when you feel comfortable and safe. So now let's talk about our allies. Let's talk about how allies can support those wanting to disclose a sexual or gender minority status. So, supporting loved ones when coming out. First and foremost, just appreciate the privileged information shared with you. If someone has disclosed privately that they are LGBTQ, just acknowledge how sensitive that information is. Try to acknowledge how much that person trusts you, loves you, and may be relying on your support for their betterment. If you suspect someone may be LGBTQ and may be in the process of checking in with themselves and then maybe setting a plan to come out, I always encourage a person to let the other person know. Often in my work with people, many people just say, like, I wish my mom would just ask me, or I wish someone would just ask me. That's not always the case, but if that is the case and you feel you have enough rapport and there's a good, loving, mutual, reciprocal relationship with that person, maybe just ask them. I've seen that be really effective for people. Okay. And again, if you are an ally supporting someone about to come out, Help assess whether it's safe for them to disclose who they are. Consider any potential threats or also traumatic experiences that they may have suffered or you may have seen them suffer. If someone feels at risk of losing food, access to food, clothing, shelter, the basics, and an overall just sense of safety and avoiding violence, which sometimes is the case, unfortunately, even in 2023, perhaps reconsidering coming out. And again, as an ally, support that person and help them make this plan in case they find themselves without housing, unable to have steady access to food, and so forth. Also, find helpful resources that can support this person in their journey. And also acknowledge if someone has disclosed to you that they're in the process of coming out, you are one of their most valuable resources. Encourage and remind your loved ones to explore their hopes and fears about coming out. Listen to them and try to help them get to understand what they can realistically expect from this experience. Support them, try to help boost their self-confidence, and at times warmly challenge any negative thoughts or feelings that they may explore with you. Ultimately, hold space for people that you know are in the process of coming out or are contemplating coming out. Holding space is as easy as sitting down and asking a person how they're feeling. Holding space is simply just having a warm, loving conversation with someone, a supportive conversation, and things like that. Now, all of this information and more can be found in my workbook I've devised and published last year entitled Coming Out, Drafting Your Roadmap for the Journey. And if anyone wants to take a picture of this or scan the QR code with their phone's camera app, this will take you directly to that off my website. So let's talk a little bit more about advocacy as a queer person and allyship. Okay, so let's start by talking about what this resiliency, advocacy, and allyship is all about. So first off, allyship is simply supporting and fighting for others when the results do not directly impact you. Let's look at it from a three-tiered basis. So a majority of this information comes from research done on ethnic and religious minorities, and I've adapted it here for the queer experience. So a wonderful speaker, Brittany Packnick, lends her perspective on allyship in this three-tiered framework. The first tier is an ally. So that supports a minority group when it's convenient. And I'm not trying to be sassy when I say that. It just is what it is. Supporting a minority group when it's convenient for that ally. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I am suggesting that there's higher levels where you could support someone. The next tier in this framework is being an accomplice. So this is when an ally shoulders some of the minority group's risk in their advocacy. So for example, if you are at a protest or a demonstration for queer rights and you're there, I mean, let's say they start arresting people. Because you're physically present at this event and showing your support for this community, for example, yeah, you may be at risk of being arrested as well. You may be viewed as a member of the queer community. So moving on, the highest tier of this level is being what's called a co-conspirator. And this is when an accomplice, an ally, is being proactive in their advocacy and shoulders the same potential consequences and risks of advocating for this community. So there's not one of these three where one should be, but just know that these are the tiers and these are the levels where it could be. Let's also look at what isn't effective allyship. So let's look at the term performative allyship. And I'm just going to read this quote. Citing buzzwords, creating social posts to perform allyship with rudimentary understandings of race and racism, and gestures that promote the significant moral compass of an individual, as opposed to dismantling oppressive systems. And again, the bulk of allyship research has been towards, again, religious and ethnic minorities. So that explains the language used here. And basically think of it as this: it's allyship until someone is personally impacted. So some questions I like to suggest to those wishing to be an ally to the community is ask yourself the following things. For example, what if my child came out as non-binary? There's a difference between supporting a cause when it doesn't directly involve you, and then there's supporting a cause when it does directly impact you or people within your same household, for example. Ask yourself, will I march also when it's not a parade? Many people love to participate in like pride festivals and the parades, but we don't always see the same faces at marches, demonstrations, protests for similar causes. Or ask yourself, what if my favorite brand donated millions of dollars to a conversion therapy camp? Think about that, for example. Or just in general, when there's a brand you may have some sort of loyalty towards, when they do something that's anti-queer, ask if you still want to give them your money going forward. Or am I marching at a protest just for the pics? This, unfortunately, is a reality and is something that needs to be addressed. Again, this ties into the performative nature of ineffective performative allyship. Or ask yourself, am I bringing heteronormativity to queer spaces? Meaning, am I bringing the assumption and just belief that I think heterosexual, being straight is normal, and am I bringing this to queer spaces? Or ask yourself, do I treat my queer loved ones as a friend or as an accessory? Unfortunately, I hear the accessory thing all too often, where people feel like some people just want, like, for example, a gay best friend rather than be friends with someone who happens to be within the queer community. And if someone asked you, an ally, if you were LGBTQ, how would you react? And last, understand the differences between being LGBTQ informed and actual allyship. So meaning there's a difference between just simply knowing that LGBTQ plus identities exist, simply knowing that there are bans out there for transgender athletes to play a sport as the gender that they feel that they truly are, versus actually making efforts and advocating for the community. So again, there's a difference between just knowing about the community and knowing that there's struggles and then actually doing something about it. So let's also look at the basics of allyship. So if one is aspiring to be an ally for the queer community, well, learn what LGBTQ plus is. Learn what the history holds and learn what current events are for the community are right now. Try your best to understand that marginalized communities may use unfamiliar terminology and lingo. So if you're not familiar with a term that's being used, simply ask, or maybe just do an online search. Investigate or ask how you can help the community. Sometimes people come to me and they say, Dr. Espinosa, how can I help the community? Well, that is a good first step right there. You're asking someone how you can be of service and how you can be support. So that's beautiful. And educate yourself on the research and data on allyship that's used in this talk, because it stems, yes, from other marginalized groups, but it goes outward. And accordingly, queer people may have intersecting identities. So educate yourself on what intersectionality is. So for example, a person could be an ethnic minority, but have a certain amount of power and privilege within their gender identity. But then again, a person may have physical disabilities, but also adhere to a religion that doesn't always support the queer community, or maybe they hold a religion that actually does affirm their identity. So just acknowledge that the humans, your loved ones who you're supporting within the community, have multiple axes to who they are. They have an ethnicity, they have a nationality, they have a gender, they have a certain level of physical ability, and may or may not have a belief system. All of these sometimes intersect, Sometimes they're congruent, sometimes they're incongruent and don't match up with the person's identity. And also understand what implicit bias is and how it may hinder one's allyship. That's a really hard one, and I know that's a huge ask, but one of the main parts of being an effective ally is checking in with yourself. Do you hold any biases? Do you hold any negative beliefs or buy into any stereotypes against the community? It's really good to understand those first, vulnerably talk about it with a loved one or maybe a mental health professional, and then work towards being a good ally. So just some brief examples, like what if a person is queer and is also of color? So for example, Black transgender lives are disproportionately impacted by violence in this country. So that's an example where two intersections that place a person at the downside of power and privilege may worsen the experience of being inauthentic. Or another example, what if a queer person was applying for asylum due to their gender minority status, and because it would be illegal to be queer in their home country. So nationality, citizenship status, and one's queer identity can all intersect. And I'll mention this twice in this talk, but part of that goal of educating oneself in the community, well, I've provided a few links here. So let's look at some online resources. Some excellent places to start: GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. There's the Genderbread Person, which can educate you on the intersections of gender, sexual orientation, and more. There's IME Guide, which is more targeted towards younger audiences, but it's a wonderful place and makes things digestible about this community, information digestible for this. There's also Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gay Persons. They've rebranded to just go by PFLAG these days, being inclusive and understanding the dynamic nature of our language and lingo. But still, nevertheless, PFLAG is an excellent resource. And then we also have the Safe Zone Project, another excellent resource. So again, anyone looking to begin their journey of being an ally can start with these things right here. But don't let that limit you. You can also try other sources as well. I also do want to briefly mention some tips on being a good ally involving just supportive behaviors and conflict resolution. Okay. So first and foremost, let's acknowledge what privilege is. I really like this quote here from Dr. Lori Sulpizio. Privilege is like being the home team. The home team is set to win. So if a person holds a certain level of power and privilege, it doesn't make you a bad person. It's just healthy to acknowledge that and then think about how that can help members of this marginalized community that you're wishing to support. So a few tips on this, on allyship. Well, speak up and then listen. Okay. Speak up and defend members of a minority community that you're wishing to support, but also listen to what they have to say. Okay. And for yourself as an ally, stop using hateful language and don't allow it if you hear it in other areas of your life. Remember, language frames our world, and framing life in hatred is just exhausting. Okay. And as I've said before, educate yourself on what the terms heterosexism, homophobia, internalized homophobia, and homonegativity mean to members of the community. And we're all human. We're all going to have missteps. We're all going to have hiccups, and we're all going to step on someone's toes a while. So acknowledge and forgive yourself if you've ever perpetuated any of the challenges to queer folks. Okay. Acknowledge that you don't have to confess to a queer person if you feel you've committed something or done something that has hurt a queer person in the past. I often hear this from clients too. They'll say like, okay, someone is trying to support me, but it really just feels like it's a confessional and they're just trying to confess how they were a bully to someone in high school or things of that sort. So for allies, know that you don't have to confess to us. That's more of a space for, again, a trusted loved one or maybe your own psychotherapist. And so take actionable steps to help. Show up and demonstrate for queer causes. Be an advocate and maybe write letters to lawmakers or help educate others on how to do so. I believe if you type into a search bar ACLU writing to lawmakers, they have an excellent article that thoroughly explains the process of doing so. And educate others on how to advocate. Once you've come to a place of solid allyship, well, encourage others to do the same. Also, ask how to help or what can make a situation easier for the queer cause. Check in and relinquish privilege often. And what I mean by that is if you know you are not at risk for something happening towards you, for just living your life, being who you are, if you know that you are in a safer place, maybe sometimes challenge that. Maybe kind of step down from that place of power and privilege. Maybe see what it's like to be on the downside of power and privilege. Okay. When you do hear negative comments out in the world, maybe suggest alternatives. Okay. And then also share platforms and disseminate info and report red flags that you see. Report internet trolls. Really, there's so many ways that we can, especially with the internet, we can be an advocate. Okay. Remember, sometimes starting small builds momentum. Remember that allyship is a skill to develop. So again, if you've decided that you want to be an ally, you've wrestled with power and privilege you may hold, you've maybe relinquished some power and privilege and maybe put yourself in the shoes of those in minority statuses, still, this is all great work, and still we're human. You're still going to have hiccups. You're still going to make mistakes. Queer people are still going to make mistakes too. Just remember, allyship is a skill to develop. Anything that you have to develop takes time. Beyonce wasn't built in a day. Okay. So actually, we're going to move past this. Move past this as well. Okay, now let's talk about those resources I mentioned. So let's start here in LA County. So please feel free to take a picture of this, or feel free to contact me at a later time and I can provide this to anyone who's interested. These are tangible resources that we have in LA County. So it ranges from some psychotherapy worksheets I've put together for members of the queer community. We also have the Family Crisis Center. We have APLA Health and Wellness. We have Gender Justice LA. We have the Trans Wellness Center. We have PFLAG with a location in Los Angeles. And these are just some of the resources that I encourage anyone to look into if they're looking to receive support and services or looking to help provide that support for others. Moving on, let's look at some national resources. Even though the state of California is not a nation, we have the California Youth Crisis Line. Then again, if someone feels like they're at risk by coming out of losing access to food, clothing, shelter, and physical safety, there's food pantries all around. So if you just type into a search bar, 211 or nearest food pantry, that could provide this. We have Feeding America. As always, we have National Adult Protective Services for older adults. We have NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We have the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We have SAMHSA's National Hotline. And we have the Trans Lifeline. Okay, and then I'm going to show this one more time. For those wishing to educate themselves in the queer community as an ally, some excellent introductory resources, again, are GLAD, the Genderbread Person, which is a website, IME Guide, PFLAG, and the Safe Zone Project. And if anyone has any other excellent resources, please feel free, put them in the comments. Okay. That all said, I want to again thank everyone for showing up for this talk. Again, I want to thank the Los Angeles Public Library Network for hosting this today. I want to thank also the Los Angeles County Psychological Association for sponsoring this. And I want to wish everyone a fantastic National Coming Out Day. And now I'm happy to take any and all questions you may have. Okay. I'll just give a few moments if anyone wants to type in a question. Okay, I see a question on when this will be available on YouTube for those who have missed it live. To my knowledge, it should be immediately available. That's been my experience with previous talks I've provided for Los Angeles Public Library. Okay, let's see, I have a comment. And for those wondering, the link to the workbook I mentioned that has all of this information and then some is right here in the comment section. Okay, I see a comment here. It reads, as a clinician, what hardships do you see the most in the queer community? That's an excellent question. Thank you, Michael, for this. Let me start as a doctor. So I'm a doctor, so I treat symptoms. The symptoms I've typically seen for those within the queer community and the diagnosis I've typically seen, and also backed up by the research, suggests that anxiety spectrum disorders, depressive disorders, trauma response disorders tend to be the top three types of diagnoses I see. So those are the hardships in terms of mental health that I typically see clients live with. Of psychosocial concerns I typically see, it's calling back to one of the previous slides that I had. It's living inauthentically, having to create a false persona of oneself and having to maintain that lie. I've seen people unable to find their tribe, find their people that they feel are close with, an inability to find one's chosen family. And then I have to be realistic to your question, Michael. Often there still are threats of violence that I see for the clients I've worked with. There's threats of violence, and again, lack of access to just our basic needs, stable housing, access to food, and then basic needs like clothing. So those are typically the adversities I see members of the queer community deal with being inauthentic and not being able to come out. Excellent question. Thank you. Any other questions from you all? Okay, I see one. Let me just read it. Oh, it popped up here. That's nice. Let's see. Some cultures and their people do not necessarily come out. And I believe that coming out is a strong Western concept. Oh, okay. Interesting. Actually, there's another comment. So let me read this. It's a follow-up. I'm just going to read what this individual is putting. Seeing as I come from a Southeast Asian collectivistic background, I believe there can be a risk of imposing Western culture onto others and inherently focusing our ideas on other cultures. I definitely see your point. So, excellent. So, for the sake of this talk, yes, the research was conducted and the polls were conducted in the United States. So, yes, this is definitely coming from a Western mindset. And I think that's an excellent thing to bring up. Always, when we're working in mental health, it's always important to come from a cultural lens, a multicultural lens, or being what's called culturally responsive. So, yes, if a person has checked in with themselves and they feel this process of coming out is not congruent with their culture and maybe imposes Western and European ideals, then by all means, adapt it to oneself. Because as I've been saying, this process is a journey. Everyone's journey looks a bit different. It may be a journey, maybe a quest, and that's different for each person. So I really thank you for bringing that up. I also see a follow-up question from this person. What are your thoughts on this as a clinician and imposing your own beliefs and values? Let me think about that. What are your thoughts on this as a clinician, your own beliefs and values? Well, as the clinician, we often do, whether we like it or not, impose just our own intersections in the space when we're doing psychotherapy with somebody. The days of Freud are long gone. No one is truly a blank slate in the room. So I present with my own intersections in the therapeutic space, as does the client. Some of my intersections are minority statuses. Some of them are positions of power and privilege. So it's about understanding that with ourselves. So about imposing our own values and beliefs onto clients, I mean, that's something that should always be checked in on and acknowledged. And it could be as simple as just asking the client, how does that feel? Does that feel like I'm coming from a Western lens? Is what I'm saying congruent with your culture? Is this congruent with how you grew up? Do you see, based off the advice I've given you or the empathic challenges I've posed to you, do you see this actually sitting well with you, given your intersections, your lifestyle? So I think that's an excellent thing to ask. As psychotherapists, we strive to be neutral, not necessarily a blank slate for our clients. But yeah, thank you for that question. Any other questions? These are great. And we have about 9 minutes carved out. Open to any and all questions. Okay. I see a follow-up question from the same person. What influenced you to be in this career path? For myself, I I've always thought I was going to be a therapist for some reason. Even at a young age, I still have it. I have a Bugs Bunny diary where I was writing to myself at age 13 that I think I wanted to be a psychologist. For myself, the duties of being a psychologist fulfilled a very familiar role I played in my family of origin, and so I found a way to, through sublimation, a Freudian term, I found a way to make a living of it, of holding space for other people, understanding my own inner workings as it can hopefully help and support another person dealing with who they are and influencing that. Not everyone who becomes a clinical psychologist necessarily has to follow that path, but thanks for asking. That was my path. It just always fit in with my personality, and I love what I do. These questions are good, y'all. Okay, I see one more. You all have such great grammar too, which could be a Western ideal as well. Okay, I'm seeing one from Ralph. With regards to internalized homophobia, I find that even after accepting oneself, there seems to be some sort of bias that remain probably hidden in our subconscious due to societal upbringing. Okay, and then there's a follow-up. Is there a way to find that it exists, and how do we find a resolution to it? Okay, let me just think about this for a moment. Okay, yeah. So what I think you're asking about, Ralph, is yes, once one person has already identified some negative internalized beliefs and hopefully processed it and feels like they've addressed it as much as they can, they still feel there's that indelible stain of that implicit bias. And that is often the case. So, for example, a different example, let's say a person used to hold racist ideals and beliefs, and they've worked on it, they've relinquished their power and privilege, they actually advocate now for members of an ethnic minority, or just examples like that. I hear this often. There still is that indelible stain of where they came from. There's still that implicit bias that tends to be there. And what I say to that is just acknowledge you're a human. You were raised or conditioned to believe a certain way. You, as an adult and mature person, actively challenge that and are making good efforts and behaviors to go against that. But that indelible mark is just that, it's indelible. Sometimes it will always be there. And that is something we have to consciously wrestle with every day of our lives and actively challenge every time it pops up. I've seen that with racism. I've seen that with homophobia. I've seen that with internalized homophobia. So like, for example, clinically, I've seen it where a person has come out, they've found a partner, they've gotten married to that same-sex partner, and they're just living their best life. But still, once in a while, they don't want to hold hands in public, or they feel the risk, or they feel that tinge of fear. Or they saying, oh, my husband or my wife, respective to the gender of the person they married, they just say my spouse or my partner. So unfortunately, I do hear what you wrote about, Ralph, and it's an active daily effort. I crosswalk it to also someone who may be in like substance recovery. They may still have that drive to use that substance of choice every day, but it's that active daily personal empathic challenge that keeps us afloat. So really good question. Thank you, Ralph. Okay, we have about 4 more minutes, a little under 5 minutes. Any other good questions? These are great. The window's closing. For any other questions? In therapy, we would call this a pregnant pause. Excellent question. So I have a question from Edwin. How do I know what pronoun to use if I'm unsure? Excellent. So I see typically 2 routes with this. And please, if anyone wants to see my lecture on personal pronouns, that'll be coming out soon through my website. First and foremost, just ask. If you're not sure what pronoun someone uses, the fact that you're asking respectfully dog whistles to that other person. Oh, okay, this person's cool. This person actually cares to not misgender me. Also, too, when in doubt, just use a neutral one like they, them. Like, oh, what are they doing? Or when in doubt. So 3 points. The third one is just use the person's first name. So again, just to run through those 3 again with our limited time, just ask the person because it signals that you care. Second, just use their name. It's pretty easy to use someone's name. And then third, what was that other one I just said? So, oh, and use a neutral one, like they, them, theirs. Good question, Edwin. Also, too, a great tip on understanding someone else's pronouns, use your own. Like something I could do for myself. I say, I'm Dr. Espinosa. I use he, him, his, el. And that also dog whistles to the person. The fact that I'm willing to say that about myself and disclose that first lets the other party know, oh, they can disclose what their pronouns are. So that helps facilitate the conversation too. Also, simply just putting your pronouns on like your email signatures, your name tags, or again, just saying it in conversation when you meet people, that's a great way to learn what the other party's pronouns are. So really good question. Okay, I think we're in our last minute. Excellent questions, y'all. Really great. It was good to not see trolls, which was good. And again, I want to thank everyone who participated in this. So Los Angeles Public Library, Los Angeles County Psychological Association. Thank you so much for hosting this and facilitating this excellent conversation. I hope you were all able to receive something positive and effective from this. And this webinar should be immediately available here on YouTube on LA Public Library's channel. Thank you, everyone.